All right, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Halloween. My name is Andre Flesch. I'm a professor of history at Vermont State University, Castleton, and I'd like to start our program today by thanking the Ira Historical Society for welcoming our class and arranging this event. The good news is that we got a dark and stormy night. But the bad news is that we got a dark and stormy night. So we had originally hoped that we would be outside and able to tell some of these stories in front of the historic buildings that you have here in town, but history is an imaginative discipline. So we'll have to imagine we're outside looking at the Baptist church or looking at some of the early schools or this town hall here or the fields beyond, and the students will do their best to assist us in that regard. This is a class in the United States before the Civil War, so from the early 1800s to about the year 1861. And over the course of the semester, we've been studying that time period, but also studying the practice of public history. In other words, how historians talk to and educate the public about the past. And a number of historians have pointed out that increasing numbers of Americans get their antebellum U.S. history through ghosts, right? Through the ghost tour industry and ghost TV. Anybody that's visited Gettysburg or any of our historic cities know that there's innumerable ghost tours on offer, and today the History Channel, you turn that on, and much of it is ghosts and aliens. And I think that there is a reason for that, right? Tales of ghosts offer mystery and engagement, and they intrigue the public. But in our class discussions, we also pinpointed the problematic nature of that, the fact that many of these ghost tours make up their stories and veer towards the sensational rather than the historical. So our mission here tonight is to do better than that. We want to draw on the best practices of the ghost tour industry in captivating the imagination, but the students were strictly instructed that these all had to be true stories. They couldn't make anything up. So, and you may be wondering where they got their information from. Well, all of the presentations and stories tonight come from early town histories, local newspapers, and local census records. Now, I do have to admit that we were challenged in finding spooky stories. Just to point out, after all, a town historian of the 1920s boasted that Ira, quote, has never produced a capital criminal nor a candidate for the state's prisons. Hopefully that's still true, but it doesn't provide the best fare for Halloween. But we still think we can engage you all tonight while recalling the spirit of a long ago past, because at the end of the day, that is the job of the historian, to bring the past and past events to life. But we did discover one ghost story, so to set the tone, I will start by sharing the story of Peter Parker, who I suppose you could call Ira's own Ichabod Crane, as recounted by a historian of the late 1800s. Parker, we're told, settled here in Ira in the early 1800s and was known as a great poet and storyteller. Like Ichabod Crane in the legend of Sleepy Hollow, he was also reputed to be, quote, a great lover of the feminine gender. But unlike Crane, he was also known for his courage as a tough and eager fighter. Parker also dabbled in the supernatural. Historians tell us that he told fortunes of the local people in exchange for barrels of cider. Well, one dark night, some local rascals decided to test Parker's courage. He was known to be planning to travel through a woodlot that we're told was on the north end of town, east of Bird Mountain. And so local school children planned to surprise him. They made an apparition stuffed with straw, attached to a pulley that they tied up in a tree so that it could move back and forth like a ghost. And on this dark night, Parker started on his journey, and as he saw the apparition moving between the trees, he drew his fists and shouted, "Who are you, God, man, or the devil?" He then delivered a punch to the specter, which fell harmlessly into the roadway. The brave Parker then approached the figure, stole the clothes, kept them for himself, and walked on his way. So I assume he proved to the local children that he was indeed a brave man. So that is our true Ira ghost story that we uncovered. And we have a number of other stories that weave the past and into the present in Irish history. So first up is Brooklyn Kimball, who will give us some background about Ira and the town.
Hi everybody, again my name is Brooklyn, and I'm going to start you off with just a bit of background information kind of about the town, just to give you more of a solid foundation to what the rest of my classmates are about to tell you. So in 1761, the Ira Valley was opened by pioneers from southern New England looking to build a community out in the wilderness. In May, the first town meeting was held and to elect local officials as well as take the Freeman's Oath, which was a pledge for new members of the Massachusetts Bay to kind of show their loyalty to their government. In 1776, the Revolutionary War came about, and early settlers of Ira often faced raids by Native Americans as well as attacks by British soldiers, which kind of fueled their fight for independence, but also intensified negative feelings towards Britain. With the conflict between America and Britain, it did cause tensions within local communities as well, between the independence-hungry townspeople and the outspoken British loyalists, like the prominent Ira resident, John Lee, who had his 324 acres of land confiscated, as well as his cows and a lot of other personal belongings due to his loyalties to Britain. Yet, to this day, there is no documentation of what Lee said or did to deem him a traitor. But the confiscated land was sold to the Collins family, and it was sold for just 100 English pounds, and then other personal items were sold individually. The reason for these acts of confiscation were to raise badly needed funding for Vermont's militia by seizing and selling real and chattel property of British loyalists during the Revolutionary War. And in 1797, Ira was officially organized as a town, which caused the need for more resources like schools, meeting houses, stores, restaurants, and so much more. Then in 1797, the Collins family donated a chunk of their land, which previously belonged to Lee, to build a meeting house, which was used by the Ira Baptist Church until 1852, when the church that we now see on the property now was built. Then the original structure was turned into a meeting house and select school, then renovated again in 1910, and then by 1989, the building had been so structurally unsafe that it had to be closed for the town and could no longer house events here. But that was until 1995, when the Army Reserve provided free labor for the majority of the town hall's restorations on the various floors of it. And it was completed in 2001, and it reopened this historic building into modern day Ira, and that is why we are able to be here today. Ira started off as a subsistence culture, meaning that they are self-sufficient, supporting oneself or family with what they produce or trade. Early pioneers had most of their homes double as a manufacturing plant, where they would produce the clothing for the whole family. Minus footwear, which the town had a shoemaker named John Brown for, who would spend the later half of the summer going door to door, making sure that families were equipped with the proper footwear to withstand the chilling temperatures of New England winters. Everything that the townspeople needed, they could produce themselves or find amongst their neighbors, showing the very close community. Once it was a town, it caused the erection of a variety of different businesses due to the growing traffic throughout. In 1807, Captain Daniel Graves opened a tavern, and due to its location, it was a very popular stop in the town, which Kathy will talk more about later on. And then in 1833, Daniel Graves sold the property to his two sons, George and Henry, who continued to run it as a tavern like their father. And then the Graves family were involved in many different trades, owning a tannery, a hattery, a potash manufactory, and a boot and shoe shop. These Graves industries definitely directed a lot of business into Ira, as well as employing a lot of their residents. But this all came to a halt when the construction of the railroad to Rutland started in the 1840s and was completed and opened in the 1850s. And the once buzzing town of Ira had been forgotten by its outsiders. Land, which was once family legacies, were sold, businesses were closed, and the Graves Tavern had been converted into a house and sold many times until 1854, when it entered the Fish family, who we will cover a little bit more on later in the tour. But the building did have a tavern maintained in it as kind of a tribute to its glorious past. Along with the disappearance of small businesses due to the railroad, so did manufacturing equipment once essential for families started to disappear like magic. Spinning wheels and looms, once cherished and passed down by generations, were relocated to the attic, out of sight, collecting dust. Farms once filled with chickens for eggs and meat, sheep for wool, and crops like flax for making textiles were replaced with cows for the booming dairy industry. The once subsistence town of Ira had fallen victim to the appealing ways of the market revolution, which was a shift from subsistence culture to the producing market for a profit. And that is all I have for you guys. So if we don't have any questions, I will hand it over to the next person.
Next is Kathy Rotondo, who will talk to us about the tavern.
Hi everyone, as Andre said, my name is Kathy and I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the Graves Tavern. So, we were supposed to be there, so I start by saying, welcome to the Graves Tavern, founded in 1807 by Captain Daniel Graves. We are in the midst of the Industrial Revolution in the North, while slavery is continuing strongly in the South. The abolition movement is gaining momentum and trade tensions are rising between the U.S. and Europe, with the War of 1812 on the horizon. The population of Ira is 471. Let me take you back to 1798. As Brooklyn just stated, Ira became a town in 1797. So the following year, Daniel Graves had come here, settled in Ira, seeking affordable land and business to build a business in this growing community. Though he was not known as a philanthropist, his business aspirations would be to center on the essential needs of the citizens and to offer locally produced goods and services. Following the Revolutionary War, with a population of 925, The economy and land availability near Daniel's place of Whatley, Mass. Were unsuitable, but he found Ira to be more favorable to his needs. In 1798, he also found Lois Rice, who he married. By 1807, Lois had given birth to 8 children, of which 4 sons and 1 daughter had survived until the time of 1807 as members of a growing family. So Captain Graves had mouths to feed and a family to support, so he needed to move forward with his business plan. Coincidentally, an act of 1798 proclaimed every person shall at all times be furnished with suitable refreshments, provisions, and accommodations for travelers, their cattle, and horses. The penalty of forfeiture would be $3. Could this have been the spawn in the rise of inns and taverns? Taverns, by definition, were places of business where people gathered for food, drink, and lodging. Taverns also provided space for town residents to gather for games, debates, or town meetings. Inns were noted primarily for lodging, and some occasionally offered meals to their lodging customers. Other recognized needs for taverns in the area, inns and taverns in the area, included poor road conditions, making travel treacherous and at times nearly impossible, as noted by retired British Navy Captain Frederick Marryat, who once said, "Off we went, uphill and downhill, short, steep pitches at a furious rate. There was no level ground, and it was very trying in the spring. It is very fatiguing. 100 miles of American travel is equal to 400 miles in England." So, and if any of you have ever driven your 4-wheel drive vehicle in the hills of Vermont during mud season, you know what Captain Marryat was referring to, and why large numbers of inns and taverns were needed. Imagine navigating these muddy roads with a horse-drawn stagecoach. Many towns had more than one tavern operating at the same time, and at one time there were 2 taverns in Ira. So Captain Graves built and operated his tavern on the main stage road turnpike from Troy, New York to Rutland, which is actually Route 133 right here in front of us. And I have a photo of the original tavern, which I'll let you look at. And this building still stands right past, as you start to leave town, you'll pass the dairy farm and the cemetery. The building's for sale right now. On that side is now a house, so that building is still there. Captain Graves owned the tavern until his death in 1833, when he passed the property on to his sons George and Harvey. By 1833, the Graves family also operated a tannery, which is where they turn animal hides into leather, a hattery, which is a place where hats are made and sold, and I learned that hatteries are primarily for men. If a woman wants a hat, she goes to a millinery. And the potash, I'm not sure, manufacturing, which is the process of extracting potassium carbonate from wood ashes to be used in the production of lye for soaps, dye, glass, and gunpowder. And the Graves family also owned a boot and shoe shop. So the population of Ira at this time had grown to 519, and the Graves family employed many of them. The Graves Tavern was in operation for over 30 years. The tavern served as a gathering place for residents. Town meetings were held there until this building was opened in 1854. July 4th celebrations and June trainings. June trainings were originally designed for militia training during the War of 1812 and the Battle of Plattsburgh. And when the wars were over, the June trainings continued mainly as social events for town gatherings. So while it was said that Daniel Graves wasn't much of a philanthropist as far as financial giving, he was very generous with the use of his property for all of these town meetings and social gatherings. John Palmer of Lynn, England, traveled from Vergennes to Fairhaven in 1817, apparently by horse, where he found the tavern accommodations to be good, with charges of 25 to 37.5 cents for a meal and $1 to stay overnight. He would usually find New England dishes on the table, toast dipped in cream or pumpkin pie. He was waited on by the landlord's family or other members of the household. So what else happened in a tavern in the 1800s, you might wonder? Likely activities include eating and drinking alcoholic beverages, mostly hard cider or whiskey. Food offerings would include eggs, pork, steak, pastries, pickles, cheese, and cider. The lodging patrons would gather for a morning meal, midday games and an afternoon lunch, evening supper and socializing, with more drinking and socializing. Sometimes boisterous contests or brawls would break out. Nothing like this was found documented as occurred at the Graves Tavern, and as Professor Flesch stated, no, Ira had never produced a capital criminal nor a candidate for state's prison, so nobody got in trouble here in the tavern in Ira. Overnight travelers, such as farmers or peddlers, might sleep by the fire in the main barroom. More affluent guests that could afford it could get a private room. Women were generally not welcome in the bar and were discouraged from drinking with men, and most public areas were closed to Black or Indigenous people. The tavern keepers were usually men. They were required to be licensed by local authorities and could lose that license for failing to keep an orderly house, which means regulate alcohol and prevent excessive drunkenness. And maybe that's why there's no such limited documentation of brawls or boisterousness. Founding fathers, including Alexander Hamilton, enjoyed taverns for bringing together people from all walks of life. Conversations that may have been heard in taverns back in 1807 would include, "A gentleman, a little how came you so, is reaching too high for his nut, asking for a private room," which means a gentleman who is inebriated is getting beyond his reach by insisting on a private room for the night. Or, "The bottom fact is that most of the out-of-town peddlers practice shoddyocracy," meaning the undisputed truth is that the out-of-town peddlers are selling shoddy merchandise. Important people were referred to as big bugs. A cut above would be referred to as a huckleberry above a persimmon. Likely visitors to the Graves Tavern would have included the owners, travelers seeking a meal or shelter for the night, civil, legal or militia persons, itinerant visitors or revival preachers, including Jedediah Burchard, a prominent preacher during the Second Great Awakening, known for his fiery sermons and his anxious seats, which he referred to as the pews in the front row of the church, saved for the seating of the most non-believers. Or Levi Smith, a local preacher who you will hear about later in the presentation, and social and community patrons. The Graves Tavern was in operation through the historical periods of the Industrial Revolution, the War of 1812, abolition of the international slave trade, Antebellum period of good feelings, westward expansion, the Second Great Awakening, religious revivals, the women's rights movement, and the anti-slavery movement, as America continued to grow into the country that we live in today. After a long and lively history, the Graves Tavern closed its doors due to loss of patronage after the completion of the Troy, New York to Rutland train diverted business away from Ira in 1853. The other family businesses closed near the same time for the same reasons. And the tavern was sold to the Fish family, who used the property for farming. And as I said before, the building still stands at 1186 Route 133, and I'll pass a picture of the then and now pictures. And that's all I have for you.
The reason there was no prisoners from Ira, nobody ever got caught.
Next, we have Strider Bouchette, who will be giving us a tour of local industry.
Thank you, Professor Fletch. As you all clearly heard, my name is Strider, and I will be covering the wonderful sawmills of Ira, Vermont. But before I get too far into that, I would politely ask for you to all really quickly put yourself in the shoes of Ira around, let's say, 1830-ish. We'll say that. And I would like you all to think about a night like this, where it's wet and cold and grimy. As the wind howls behind you, you're riding your cart, it's a pain. Your axle is a little askew, and your cart is rattling along. You finally make it to the tavern, and you can see other people kind of scuttling in, looking to escape the cold of night, and to seek something warm, potentially tasty for their bellies. That is the common night in Ira. However, in the daytime, before you would leave, you would need to get your cart repaired, as the roads were rough and very treacherous at times. With that in mind, the sawmills, one of the oldest sawmills in Ira that I will be covering, I will continue to refer to as the Old Sawmill. And before it was ever a sawmill, it was something called a coach works, or a place where you would get your coach or cart repaired. A very important aspect to any kind of travel or travel town or transit town, as it would be put. Here, we start with the Colvin family, the original owners of what would become the sawmill. It was located somewhere along the Ira Brook, around that area. Sorry for the lack of specifics, but it was a fairly busy business, and there was always something to be fixed. However, the ownership would be passed along to a man known to most as James C. Smith. James C. Smith was a bit interesting, as not much is actually known about him other than his approximate age, his rough time of death, and of course the business that he owned later in life, the sawmill. But before he ever owned that, there was one thing that was known about him, thanks to the Rutland Herald, who produced a paper in 1839 of his own father publicly disowning him and cutting ties. Of course, that is purely speculation because it's not as outright as I announced it, but it was a cutoff of all financial and all emotional ties. But this didn't stop James, of course. He bought the coach works that would become one of the first sawmills during the Antebellum era, and likely one of the most prominent in the area. To do this, he added a water wheel to the side of the building, and to do this, he needed to redirect some of the water from Ira Brook and elevate it above the water wheel in order for it to cascade down over it. Otherwise, it wouldn't produce enough power to fulfill the need of cutting through wood. And this was done through a collection of ways to manipulate the output power. To do this, it was typical to see the use of gears to increase this output. And it wouldn't have been unlikely to see a saw not too different from this. I will note, this is not the saw that was used in the old sawmill, but rather a later one that was beyond our time frame that we will be discussing today, of course. Though, it is not the only type of saw that you might have seen. Though this is what's called an ice harvesting saw. Similar saws would be used on a track to drive it up and down with a similar structure to that on a train car to allow it to turn the rotational energy of the the water wheel into a more back and forth type energy. But back onto the history of it. James C. Smith would own this sawmill for the majority of the remainder of the antebellum period, though there's evidence that there was some kind of drop in his production or in his income from this business, as he did maintain the coach works aspect of the business. This would have been the introduction of Ira's or the train that passes from Troy into Rutland, making it less optimal for people to drive their coaches and drive their wagons through the area. This would have put a massive dampener on the income of James C. Smith's business. So, he makes the decision to sell. He sells to a man named Lincoln, who would have been known at the time as Lincoln of Middletown Springs, a fairly proactive businessman who had a lot of interests in mills around the Vermont area. And he was the one who ultimately bought this slowing down business But he did not keep it a lumber mill or a sawmill for very long. And he completely changed the direction of where it was going. He took this, business that would harvest and process mighty trees and turned it into a cider mill and a grist mill. Of course, cider being an alcoholic beverage made from apples, and grist being roughly ground grains. Very simple food products, of course. But, unfortunately, Lincoln's ire was drawn away from this rather quickly. Whether it be he thought that this wasn't actually as good of a business venture as he initially thought, or if it were some failure in the machinery that he did not feel like he wanted to repair, he decided to ultimately abandon it, leaving this once powerful structure to rot. In the end, this mighty, mighty business was left barren and left to decay over time. And it was all the railroad that led to this, at least in theory, as there is no actual guarantee as to why it was sold to Lincoln or why Lincoln had decided to leave it behind. But these are the best guesses that we could come up with as to why it was happening. So this was the story of a very, not necessarily important business, but an important cog in the machine of Ira to allow it to function as a transit town before, of course, the railroad had come along. Thank you so much for your time.
Tyler Buxton will tell us a bit more about economic change.
Hello everyone, my name is Tyler. Thank you all for making it out today. To wrap up our industry portion started by Strider here, our next stop brings us to the tale of the wool industry and the Thornton family that turned these hillsides into a part of a booming national economy. According to Simon L. Peck in the History of Ira, Vermont, by the mid-1800s, the Thorntons controlled large tracts of land near Bird Mountain and kept flocks that number over 1,000 sheep. At the time, and depending on the year, wool could fetch up to $1 per pound, a substantial price driven by national demand and the so-called merino mania sweeping New England. In 2025, these prices would be roughly equivalent to $37.24 per pound of wool. Merino mania refers to a period in the early to mid-19th century when Vermont farmers, inspired by the importation of fine-wooled merino sheep from Spain, rushed to breed massive flocks to feed America's growing textile industry. These sheep produced wool that was finer, softer, and denser than typical English breeds, making them exceptionally sought after. Prior to this, these sheep were under the sole purview of the Spanish and illegal to export out of the country. Luckily for the Americans, raging war in Europe had destabilized Spain. Thus, the Spanish government desired to make a quick buck and decided to export the merinos. Legislature like the Embargo Act of 1807 and the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 also pushed the United States toward greater self-sufficiency in domestic production. With trade limited, domestic wool production became a national priority. This is a direct result of the market revolution that Brooklyn touched on earlier, which is defined as this shift from subsistence farming to producing goods for profit. Between 1810 and 1840, millions of sheep grazed Vermont's hillsides, with the 1840 census putting Vermont's inventory at roughly 1.6 to 1.7 million sheep. Even isolated towns like Ira became tied to national markets through wool sales and trade networks that linked them to mills in Massachusetts and beyond. For families like the Thorntons, this boom represented a chance to achieve wealth and status within a rural sect of a growing national economy. Their story captures how economic transformation reached deep into the countryside, connecting small farms to national commerce and industrial change. But the prosperity didn't last. As the wool market declined later in the century, many of these pastures were abandoned or converted for dairy production. So I guess you could say that the wool industry is a ghost of Ira. Still, the Thornton lands and old stone walls around Bird Mountain stand as a reminder of how national economic forces reach deep into small towns, and how Vermont's antebellum farmers lived at the intersection of tradition, innovation, and market pressure. As you stand near these old pastures, we can imagine the challenges: sheep needing winter shelter, wool yields fluctuating, markets on the move, and the Thornton family balancing farming, land, and town responsibilities.
Next, Brian DeMoya will tell us about an early town founder.
Hi guys, today I get to tell you about a grave. Down the road, beyond the gates of the Riverside Cemetery, there lie a fish. Preserved fish. Preserved was an early settler of Vermont. He was born on November 5th, 1770, and died in 1849 at the age of 79. Preserved lived through a time when Vermont was still wild and newly settled. The forests were dense, the soil was rocky, and every cleared acre represented back-breaking labor. Yet it was in these rugged hills that Preserved and his family built their lives. By the early 1800s, Preserved and his family, the Fish family, had become an important part of Ira's growing community, owning land, raising children, and contributing to early civic life. Records show that the family remained here for generations. Like most Vermonters of the Antebellum era, the Fish family were subsistence farmers. People who lived off what they could grow, make, and trade. A typical year revolved around the rhythm of the land: planting in the spring, haying in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and repairing tools and whatever you needed to get through the winter. Their diet came from their own fields and barns. They ate corn, beans, potatoes, apples, milk, and drank cider. Money was scarce, so families bartered for what they could get. A day's labor for a bushel of grain, or lumber traded for cloth. These small farmsteads weren't just places to live, they were self-contained worlds bound by kinship and necessity. Life was demanding, but it was deeply communal. Neighbors helped one another with barn raisings, shared tools and seed, and gathered in the meeting house to discuss local affairs, worship, and celebrate milestones. Civic duty and self-reliance went hand in hand, values that Preserved Fish seemed to embody in both name and spirit. His name, Preserved, might sound a little funny. I'll tell you, because it sounded funny to me when I first heard it. But it was in early New England, it had a powerful meaning. It came from Puritan roots, and it meant preserved in faith. It reflected a belief that endurance, both physical and spiritual, was central to survival. And in a place like Ira, that endurance defined daily life. Preserved is buried with 7 of his 12 children, a reminder of how family shaped both survival and memory of these small Vermont towns. Their graves mark not only individual lives, but a way of life. One built from hard work, faith, and the enduring hope that the land they tamed would support generations to come. Inscribed on his grave reads, "Raised from the dust on that eternal plan that fashioned dust in the shape of man, behold the world of sin, vanity, and pain. Then close my eyes and turn to dust again." We remember that Ira was built by people like the Fish family, settlers who cleared the fields, raised their barns, and built the foundation of Ira's community and character. Their legacy lives quietly beneath the soil of Ira, preserved in name, in faith, and in the history of a place they called home.
Now, Z.E. will remind us of the fragility of life in this time period.
So I'm Z, and I'll be touching on some of the more sadder aspects of the antebellum era. So during this time, the mortality rate was still very high. Though modern medicine was improving, many diseases such as smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis caused many deaths in this era. Since life, especially children's, was so fragile in this era, families would have multiple kids, which would put women at risk of dying during childbirth. Most births were done with a midwife, which was one of the few jobs that women could do during this time, though that was slowly changing. Women were seen as healers, which is why many of them would help in childbirth and care for the sick. At first, male midwives were seen as taboo, and many of them had even been prosecuted. However, as medicine progressed, the male physicians would take over the practice starting at the end of the 18th century, but by the early 19th century, they would have practically monopolized it on the East Coast. There were many professions that women were pushed out of at this time in favor of a male-dominated workforce. It was also in this time was emphasized that a woman's place was in the home. However, many women would challenge this and speak out about women having more rights, and this would lead to the birth of the civil rights, or the women's rights movement. Now let's get back to life's fragility and the leading causes of death during this time. Besides diseases and possibly non-surviving birth, they also had to worry about natural disasters. And you may think, we live in Vermont. We don't have many hurricanes, earthquakes, or tornadoes. Though we do not get many of these, Vermont can get very cold in winter, which puts people at risk for hypothermia or frostbite. Another thing we get, which we have experienced a lot in these past few years, is flooding, which is what this next story is about. Ira has had many floods in the past, some coming out of nowhere. In July of 1847, one of these floods occurred. In the early afternoon, clouds began to show in the southwest, and an occasional rumbling of thunder could be heard, which would accumulate in a heavy downpour, which would eventually hit Ira. This rain would make the brook and its tributaries rise higher and higher, which would also cause many bridges to be swept away. At around 4 p.m., the school was let out, and the rain was still coming down. Though we do not know the exact schoolhouse, there is a high chance that the schoolhouse at the time was the Ira Central School, which is estimated to have been built in the 1780s and closed in 1991. The schoolhouse still stands and can be found across the street next to the Baptist church. At some point between the schoolhouse and our home, which we do not know exactly where it was, a schoolgirl named Elizabeth Brown was swept away by the water and carried downstream. Her body would be found the next day, buried in the sand, with only her hand reaching out of it. What's even sadder about this story is that this is one of our only records of this young girl, because she was born in between the 1840 and 1850 census, and that there is no record of her birth or death certificate. This story is one of the few records of her short life. Thank you.
Given the fragility of life, religion was very important to the people in the 19th century, and Evan Primo will tell us about that.
All right. So, I'm Evan. Thank you all for coming here today. Today, as many of my colleagues have discussed, we're looking at the antebellum era in American history. So, we're looking at 1850 around to 1860. So, today I'm going to take you back to the 19th century. So, strap in because we're heading to 1831. I brought you guys there. All right. So I bet you're wondering why I brought you back here to 1831. Well, I've taken us back here to take a look at religious revivals here in Ira. So what is a religious revival? A religious revival is a religious ceremony where the community gathers to celebrate a person or group reaffirming their faith. And as Reverend Joseph Packer of Ira writes in his telegram to Reverend Walker of the town Brandon, these people followed in the footsteps of their Savior, and were immersed in the liquid grave. So, what does this mean? The liquid grave would be described as the process of being baptized, and your sins, your death, they would say, your sins would be washed away. So you'd be immersed in the grave and you would seek new life in the faith. So since Ira is a Baptist town, that means its revivals would be done through baptism in the Ira Brook. So revival ceremonies would see baptism candidates walk from the church to the brook, where they'd be fully submerged in the water and again immersed in the liquid grave. So revivals here in Ira were a big deal in the town, and ceremonies would be grand celebrations. The history of revivals in Ira runs deep, and in this time period, we're looking at the town as an example of a nationwide phenomenon called the Second Great Awakening. So, the Second Great Awakening is a Protestant revival movement that lasted from the early 1700s to the mid 1800s. And as we sit here in 1831, the country is still seeing the effects from this movement. From 1800 to 1835, church membership across the country doubles, and the country turned to faith in mass numbers. We see that same effect here in Ira. From just 1827 through 1834, the town saw 69 revivals. For a town of just 442 people, according to the 1830 census, that means around 15% of the town turned to faith in just this small time period. So, why did we come here to 1831 specifically? We're here in 1831, which here in Ira was known as the revival year of 1831. This year in the town's history saw 36 revivals. So that means that more than one revival would be happening every 2 weeks. So these grand celebrations would be happening pretty much every weekend. Unfortunately, the census didn't tell us how many of the town's people were already part of the church, but it is assumed that a large percentage of the town's population would have been part of the church. So let's take a deeper look at the country in Ira and see why there was this dramatic shift in faith. So, the Second Great Awakening and its effect on the country is directly tied to the Market Revolution, an idea that a fellow of my colleagues have talked about. The Market Revolution was a switch from subsistence farming to market-oriented farming. So why did this affect religion? The main reason is that in a time when the country is seeing rapid change, people see the church as a place where they would have consistency in their lives. It was a part of their lives that wasn't changing and would be consistent in these dramatic times. So another impact of the Market Revolution was that it brought a change in thinking. As people started to rethink their way of life and focus on individual enterprise, we see a connection to the new ideas of the Second Great Awakening. Like the idea that one has to choose salvation, and it is our actions on this earth that affect where we'll end up after death. Apart from thinking, we also see people coming back to the church as a way to deal with the anxiety and stress that comes with this new shift in the economy. For subsistence farmers who are trying to make their way of life and may have brought some hard times financially, we see people turn to faith and religion to deal with that. So, overall, the Market Revolution has deep ties in the growth of the Second Great Awakening and brought people back to faith. As we have learned today, 1831 Ira is an example of what is happening in towns and cities across the country. And religious revivals were a big part of the growth of the church in town. So, what does this mean? What does everything I've said mean? So, essentially, what's happening here in Ira is happening on a nationwide. So, small towns and cities are seeing religious revivals happen in increased numbers, especially past the point of 1800. We see, as I mentioned, the nationwide church membership double. So at this time, what we're seeing here in Ira is happening everywhere, meaning that religion is just becoming a deeper part of people's lives. And for reasons as I stated, this has a lot to do with the changing times. So a time period when you would go from living off your land and, as we talked about, growing your crops and just kind of making your way of life to survive, to grow and trade everything you needed, dramatically shifting over a small period of time to now you have to make one crop to sell and make everything else you need would be very, very stressful for people at this time, which is why we see them turning to religion in such increased numbers. As well as other reasons I noted, just the shift in economy would make people not feel really great. It brought a lot of anxiety and stress to families. Church was always a way to connect, especially as some hard times come. maybe your business went out of, maybe you're looked down upon in the church or in the town for any reason, church would be a great way to come back to that. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to highlight how deep of a connection Revival's had here in Ira. The town saw so many of them over its history, and as a town that still hosts a Baptist church, that history is still here and still alive. So, thank you all for your time, and I hope you picked up something from my spiel there about Revival. So, thanks guys.
Finally, Connor Allcroft will bring us up to the Civil War.
All right, how's everybody doing this afternoon?
Very good.
All right. As a member of the Vermont National Guard, I am very excited to present to you about the American Civil War, the latest point in the Antebellum era. Drawing back to revivalist religion, revivalist religion preached freedom, equality, and salvation for all. So many people living in the northern United States and Ira, Vermont believed in this preach. This developed a formal responsibility in ending the long economic institution of slavery. In the early 19th century, Vermont had already established abolition as far back as the 18th century, and therefore established itself as a free state, along with other states in the northern United States, against the southern slave states. As you know, this led to a political divide, and in 1860, the South seceded from the Union, embarking into the American Civil War. Now, as you know, many volunteers volunteered for the Union Army. There are over 40 Ira community volunteers in the American Civil War. Two of these volunteers are very special. In this memorial outside of our door, there is two special brothers. These brothers are the Peck brothers, Harrison J. Peck and Charles W. Peck. In 1861, these two brothers attended the Rutland County Fair. In the Rutland County Fair, there was a rifle competition to test your marksmanship and enlist in the Union Army. These brothers participated in this competition. The rifles they used were muzzle-fired muskets, meaning you loaded it from the front, and you had an 150-yard target to complete 10 rounds within one circle. If you were a subsistence farmer, this was usually the rifle of choice in your household at the time of the Antebellum era, so that was the rifle that was used for this competition. The brothers were distinguished in this competition and were prestigiously enlisted into the Union Army. They were enlisted into F Company of the famous Colonel Berdan's sharpshooters. As they entered the conflict, they were introduced to new weapons, breech-loading rifles. Now, breech-loading rifles were different as you loaded them from the rear. So this was a rifle that was not familiar to the Vermont region at the time. The Peck brothers would participate in many campaigns in northern and southern Virginia under the Army of the Potomac under General George B. McClellan. Charles W. Peck is the first to be wounded in the Peninsula Campaign in April of 1862, and he is sent home. Harrison J. Peck, the older sibling, makes it to the Second Battle of Bull Run, where he is also wounded and honorably discharged in October of 1862. After the war, Harrison J. Peck would attend Albany Law School and later move to Minnesota and reside in California as well until his death in 1913.
Charles W. Peck would remain in Vermont and start a career as a physician until his death in 1916. The youngest sibling, Simon Peck, who did not participate in conflict, wrote an article within the history of Ira, Vermont, called "The Two Boys Who Shot Themselves into the U.S. Army." This heroic tale of two brothers is one of the many tales of the great sacrifice of many volunteers and many veterans of the American Civil War. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Does anyone have any questions for our presenters?
Are you gonna write some of this up? There's very interesting stuff there.
Yeah, well, we have all their scripts. So
How do we get at it?
what do you think, guys?
We can make it into a little book.
I'm sure we could.
Bring it back.
That'd be good. Yeah. Let's do it.
I can't hear very well.
That would be very nice.
There we go.
Little something.
I was just curious as to how each student picked
You guys
topic that they were going to.
Let's do a little Q&A, guys. What? Q&A? Questions and answers? I think that's great.
So how did each of you pick these topics?
Well, I picked the tavern because I thought it was the most fun.
I picked sawmills because I have been known to go exploring along brooks to find old mills, and I find them really interesting and like really tangible aspects of our history, even in relatively young places like Vermont.
I thought the name Preserved Fish was a pretty funny name, and I looked further into it, and he had named one of his sons Served, so his name was Served Fish. And that's what sparked my inspiration.
I did my research on revivals mainly through, there was a lot of course content on them through the Book of Ira and a lot of newspapers that I researched in, so there was a lot to cover there, and I thought that'd be a great topic to do.
When we were looking at the flood, I'm the one that found an excerpt from a book about the Ira Baptist Church, so then I ended up just doing more research on it.
I chose the kind of background information on the establishment of the town just because I feel as though it is very important to kind of appreciate what came before you in order to appreciate what we have now. So kind of talking about the town hall and all of the amazing work that has been done to it over the years, I think that is very important to recognize, and that the town is still continuing to preserve these historic sites.
Well, I actually started out with going along with two scripts. Brian and I found out about Preserved Fish together right over there, and I was gonna do a piece on his son Enos, but I also found information regarding the wool industry, and I just found that quite interesting. I thought the whole importation of sheep from Spain was also very interesting, so I wanted to delve into that.
All right, so I picked the Civil War because I'm very fond of our United States military. I'm currently serving myself, and I have a lot of veterans. Great-grandfather was a World War I veteran. Grandfather was in Korea, and I've had two cousins in Afghanistan, and two great-uncles in World War II. So that's mainly, and I also love military history as well. I favor that most in my studies. Our professor here is specializes in the Civil War, so he was probably critiquing me a lot during that discussion. But that's the reason why I picked the Civil War.
And I'm sure I speak for all of us up here when I say thank you for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much.